the first annual general meeting of the Joint Local Plan Partnership Board to be held in public. I'm Councillor Judy Pearce. I'm leader of South Hams District Council, and I also have the dubious distinction of being the only surviving member, uninterrupted, from the first steering group meeting of the Joint Local Plan. So I'm going to give you a short introduction and a few house rules for this afternoon, and then I'm going to hand over to officers who will take you through the rest of the agenda. The Plymouth and South West Devon Joint Local Plan was adopted in March 2019, and so the monitoring report to be presented today represents the first complete year of the plan's life, from the beginning of April 2019 to the end of March 2020. The report comes so long in arrears because there's a great deal of data to be collected and collated, as anyone who's read the agenda from start to finish will appreciate. And also, the COVID restrictions have not helped matters at all. The purpose of the monitoring report is statutory and is explained in the introduction, which is on page 6 if you have the agenda on modern.gov. Officers will explain the nuts and bolts which hold it together further when introducing the next agenda item. Meanwhile, I thought it might be useful to some of you to outline briefly what the Joint Partnership Board does, or perhaps what it doesn't do. 2 members are appointed from each council and a non-voting member from Devon County Council. It's not a joint committee, and so it cannot take any major decisions itself. Any decisions concerning the review, implementation or amendments to the Joint Local Plan have to be taken through the standard governance processes of each constituent council. The job of the Partnership Board is to maintain a clear programme for preparation, monitoring and review of the Joint Local Plan and associated supplementary planning guidance. It's also to provide active and dynamic overview of the performance of each local planning authority in meeting and maintaining a 5-year housing land supply, which is now officially jointly monitored across the whole Joint Local Plan area. Nevertheless, individual authorities can be held to account by the board, which will identify where key targets are not being realised and ensure that appropriate action is taken by the joint officer team overseeing the plan to try to resolve and further identify any other problems. A key function of the board is also to keep under review changes to the international, national and regional context which can or could affect the plan and its delivery. This year has been very busy with the COVID pandemic, where the full economic effect on housing delivery is yet to be assessed. We've had the government white paper on planning and the associated discussion on algorithms and housing numbers, and various permitted development introductions and/or consultations. Meetings of the Partnership Board are held roughly quarterly, so we've not yet discussed the latest proposals on the revision to the NPPF or New Homes Bonus. The Joint Officer team has officers from all 3 councils and is now headed up by Joanna Lee, who you will meet in a minute, since Richard Grant's departure to Cornwall Council. Jo and some members of her team you will meet up with in the rest of the agenda. So just a few housekeeping rules now. Can I ask you to please keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off unless you are called to speak. If you have a question, please enter it in the chat bar. If there is time, we may answer some of these, but if not, they will be answered either by a frequent FAQ response, which can be posted on the JLP website and circulated to members, or through the workshops, which will be explained more fully at the end of this afternoon's meeting. These are being proposed as a way of giving the wider membership more engagement in strategic planning and the nuts and bolts of how the JLP works. My fellow board members and I hope you enjoy this afternoon's agenda items and find them useful and informative. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Jo Lee, who will introduce the authority's monitoring report.
Thank you very much, Judy. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about the Joint Local Plan and what it's delivering. I'm going to start sharing the screen, for you all to see the presentation, so just bear with me for a second. Hopefully you can all start to see that. I'll take it as a yes until someone stops me.
Allow this website to configure DBOS.
So before I start, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to my team, Grant, Phil and Joe, for making me so welcome and answering all my endless questions since I started in October. I also want to thank particularly all the officers across the councils that have worked so hard pulling the information together for this monitoring report. What I'd like to do is take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what the joint local plan is aiming for and why it's important. We'll then move on to what is being delivered by the plan. So the plan sets out an ambitious vision for the whole area to be highly successful with an emphasis on sustainability. For Plymouth, we want to achieve a vibrant waterfront city, and for the towns and villages, we want to deliver thriving, connected communities. We are responding to and planning for the area based on how it functions, unconstrained by administrative boundaries. And we are one of the very few areas to have such a groundbreaking approach, and it is something we should all be really proud of. The two policy areas, but one approach, means we can focus growth in the most sustainable locations, largely within the Plymouth policy area. We have allocated land for 26,700 homes on about 117 sites across the whole area. The strategy at Plymouth concentrates on three growth areas: the city centre and waterfront, Derriford and the Northern Corridor, and the Eastern Corridor, including Sherford. As the figures show, 71% of the homes will be delivered in the Plymouth policy area as a highly sustainable and accessible location supported by infrastructure. In the thriving towns and villages, the plan provides for the development of 7,700 homes concentrated at the main towns of Totnes and Ivybridge, as well as Tavistock and Oakhampton, but not forgetting other sustainable settlements too. The plan also seeks to support over 13,200 new jobs, and it allocates over 350,000 square metres of employment land. I want to also take the opportunity to remind us all of the importance of having an adopted plan. It gives us control and enables us to achieve what we want to in a planned way. And while we may not all agree with all the sites, at least we know what we're going to get. It gives us an ability to get affordable housing contributions, meet open space standards, and provide for biodiversity net gain, as well as going further to seek carbon reduction and infrastructure improvements. So you may recall the difficulties we faced when we had no plan and no 5-year land supply. Without it, we may struggle to resist speculative development that is contrary to policy. We would be faced with making unpalatable decisions on locations we don't want and are contrary to the plan, such as green space, and where there is little infrastructure capacity. An adopted plan is also really important to secure funding and join up bids. It is also worth remembering that if we don't have a plan, we're in danger of intervention by the minister, like South Oxfordshire, who were recently ordered to adopt their plan. The key achievement this year has been the adoption of the supplementary planning document. This supports the joint local plan policies and provides guidance to developers about what we expect. And while it doesn't introduce new policies, it explains what we want, such as how to deliver low carbon development through policy Dev 32. It is accompanied by a developer contributions evidence base and the very useful barn guide that provides guidance on the adoption, adaptation and reuse of traditional farm buildings. But otherwise, SPD replaces the various and previous documents and sets everything out clearly in one place. I know it's exceptionally long, but if you are interested in specific issues and policies, which obviously I hope you all are, or even if you're on the planning committee, I recommend reading it one evening. And that's obviously an particularly exciting activity for this lockdown, so no excuses. In terms of what we're doing today and the current position, the plan was adopted, as Judy said, in March 2019, so it's nearly 2 years old. And as you can see in the timeline, we're at the stage of implementing policies and delivering sites. And a key part of this is monitoring what is being provided so that we can understand how the plan is working. I just want to take the opportunity to clarify that we're not in the formal review stage of the plan. This review, or the next review, is required by March 2024, and we will start thinking about this in the next few years and once we have much more clarity about the government's planning reforms. The presentation today is really about reporting on the plan indicators. There's lots of details in the Authorities Monitoring Report, and if you don't want to read it all, there's a really handy summary table in the conclusions section on page 63. And what we're going to do is take you through some of the most interesting topics and key findings, starting with housing, then employment, and moving through to cover retail and tourism, connectivity, air and water, climate change, and neighbourhood plans. The monitoring work shows that we have a really good supply of land for housing across the area. We have a 6.1-year housing land supply and have successfully passed the housing delivery test, and most recently scoring 144% on the latest figures. Across the whole area, 8,663 homes have been built, which is above the planned target, and there is a really good supply going forward. It's useful to remember that once a site is included in the joint local plan, it is in principle acceptable for that use. And we now need to actively follow up with developers to make sure sites work so that they are granted permission and actually deliver the homes people need. The provision of affordable homes is really important, and nearly 2,000 affordable homes have already been built. This means nearly 30% of the target has been delivered, and the plan is on track to meet the targets in full. The report on appendices contain a huge amount of information about housing, and this is also supported by the housing position statement and the 5-year land supply, which were published in December last year. It's useful to pick up on some of the key indicators, and as such, we monitor the amount of development granted on sites not previously identified, because this is how we can understand whether the plan strategy is working or being undermined. Overall, 80% of homes were built on identified sites. However, windfall developments are particularly high in the rural areas, and this is influenced by permitted development and Class Q, which the plan can't control. We'll be monitoring large windfall sites carefully as part of the next housing survey, because it is really important to understand the extent to which this is potentially destabilising the strategy. A greenfield brownfield figure and percentage is not available for the whole plan due to the different ways it is calculated. However, really pleased to say that the city has a greater percentage of brownfield development at 82%, and that's been consistently high over the last 10 years. And not surprisingly, in South Hams and West Devon, the percentage of development on brownfield sites is much lower. And that's partially due to the fact that these are net figures, and so replacement dwellings are not included. And it's certainly something we're looking at in the future. As part of the monitoring work, we want to understand where the homes are being built. And what the figures are showing is that more homes this year are being built in the main towns and less are being built in the countryside and villages. This is really encouraging and demonstrates that the spatial strategy in the joint local plan is beginning to be implemented. It is important to keep an eye on this, however, because of the adverse impact that dispersed growth can have on sustainability and the climate change emergency objectives. It's also worth noting that the delivery of homes at the smaller villages, hamlets and the countryside are distorted by the delivery of historic allocations in the AONB villages and the impact of the Class Q barn conversions that are beyond the plan's control. I'm going to hand over to Phil Baker to run us through the rest of the key topic areas. And Phil, just shout at me when you want me to move on the slides.
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, members. The next slide, please, Joe. One of the key indicators that we do report on is population. Indicator I-17 specifically, or was originally designed to report on Plymouth's population. We've expanded upon this to include figures for South Hams and West Devon. It just gives a slightly better overview as to how population is changing across the plan area. And also the vast majority of movement in our plan area are between our 3 local authorities. And for that reason, as we can see, there's been a slight year-on-year change in terms of Plymouth's population that shows a decrease. Although I think year-on-year, a certain amount of the increase in Southam's is attributable to the strategy that we've got that promotes growth in the Plymouth policy area around the urban fringe. All of which kind of combines to show that there has been a net increase across the plan area of just over 5,500 people from the 2014 baseline. Next slide, please, Joe. The next 3 slides kind of deal with employment in terms of numbers and jobs and employment floor space that's both been completed and consented. In terms of job figures, obviously there are a number of different factors that contribute to how the number of jobs change in an area, and your adopted local plan is only responsible for a certain amount of that change. The net change since the baseline is nearly 3,000 new jobs have been created across the plan area. When you set that against an understanding of how the working age population has changed, which has been a reduction of nearly 4,000 people, you can see that there are a number of different factors there that overlay and don't always come up with a kind of clearly comprehensible answer. Certainly the working age population is something to be mindful of. ONS data still reports on a working age group of between the ages of 16 and 64, whereas the statutory retirement age is now 67. And certainly we're aware there's a quite a high proportion of people over the age of 64 in the plan area who are still in full-time or part-time employment. So the data there is not complete in that regard. Next slide, please, Joe. So in terms of employment completions, this is employment floor space that's been built following consent. Nearly 72,000 square meters across the plan area, obviously broken down to policy area figures there. And next slide, please, Joe. And in terms of commitments, there's 163,000 square meters of additional commitments in terms of planning permissions waiting to be implemented, some of which are under construction and some not under construction. Those combined figures represent around 75% of the employment need figures in terms of employment floor space identified within the plan to 2034. And there's also that figure doesn't report on completions for the 2019-20 period because of obviously difficulties that we've mentioned previously around being able to get out and actually monitor those completions themselves. So it's a very healthy position in terms of supply, and certainly that accords strongly with the strategy identified within the joint local plan. Next slide, please, Joe. And when you ally that to certainly the figures that we've got around retail consents and completions, some of the difficulties around the pandemic lockdown periods in 2020 have led to incomplete data around how we understand completions for the B use classes and retail. Certainly as a priority, once it's safe to do so and once lockdowns are over, we'll be working as a priority to update our housing, retail and employment surveys to make sure that we've got a more complete picture in terms of progress towards and how we're meeting the targets identified for those uses in the joint local plan. With regard to the specifics of indicator I-22, which is city centre vacancy rates, again, consents have reduced ever so slightly year on year, and there's been a slight increase in terms of the number of vacant units within the city centre. Some of that will be reflected on by the early impacts of COVID-19, and obviously next year it's going to be a singular year in terms of what the impacts are that we're recording, and I'm sure everyone will understand that there may well be some anomalous results that come out of that. How that contributes to the broader trends year on year, probably we aren't going to fully understand that for another sort of 2 or 3 years in terms of allowing those trends to smooth themselves out over a period of time. Indicator I-23 relates to visitors and visitor spend in Plymouth. The specific indicator actually relates to the waterfront, but we don't have information to disaggregate to a specific part of the city. but information is available for the city as a whole, and that shows an increasing number of total visitors and visitor spend. Previously, information hasn't been available in a comparable way for lower output areas that would take into account Southampton and West Devon. I think they were only available now. They were available from 2019, 2020. So going forward, I think we'll probably take the view that we will try to report on those as well, as it kind of gives more of an oversight as to the contribution that tourism makes to our wider economy, and also Southampton and West Devon, tourism does make a significant contribution to the overall economy. So that would be a useful piece of comparable information to include. Next slide, please, Joe. In terms of connectivity, both physical and digital, the data that we've got around rail and rail station footfall and train usage shows broadly consistent data with regard to national averages. Of particular interest this time around, the local stations within Plymouth are continuing to show an increase in usage. And also the mainline station at Totnes is showing footfall increase well beyond the national average. In terms of freight and passenger numbers through seaports, the figures for Plymouth again show against sort of a minor reduction in terms of national figures, in terms of usage and freight movement. Plymouth and actually most of the South Coast ports do buck the trend a degree. There's been a very marginal decline, but certainly not to the same extent as the national figures are suggesting. So relatively speaking, they're performing quite strongly. And the indicator for broadband connectivity, indicator I12, again, these figures show broadly consistent with national averages. Plymouth ever so slightly above the figures in terms of connectivity for urban areas. And I think West Devon is marginally below what would you expect to see for rural areas. But then the nature of the geography of West Devon is particularly remote and dispersed compared to a lot of other rural areas in the country. Next slide, please. In terms of air and water quality, bathing water quality is a very strong performance for 1920 in terms of bathing water quality, and that was against a very high level of baseline from the year before as well. So of the monitoring points throughout the plan area, 17 have been identified as having excellent quality and two good. So it's very strong performance there, and testament to the way that we work collectively as a group of officers around sort of managing the catchment areas and understanding what the downstream implications are of that. And air quality again has been improving year on year. Plymouth's voluntary AQMA kind of continues to show strong performance, albeit around Mutley Plain is improving, but remains to be an area of concern. But again, when we use the phrase area of concern, it's very relative, and I think the measurements themselves are improving year on year. Same again with Southampton and West Devon. And in terms of an updated air quality status report for Southampton and West Devon, the most up-to-date report hasn't been released yet, albeit we do have all of the readings and the figures available. So that will be collated and released at some point in the near future. In terms of indicator I9, the percentage deaths attributable to particulate air pollution, again, improvements across the board for the 3 councils within the joint local plan area. If you could do the next slide, Joe, that shows the table. And again, certainly compared to the national average, as you may expect, very strong performance there. With regards to the southwest region itself, Plymouth is performing very strongly, certainly in terms of comparable to some of the largest cities in the southwest, and Southampton and West Devon are right at the bottom of the table there, showing really strong performance in terms of against that air pollution indicator. Next slide, please, Joe. The indicator I16, so the carbon emissions, the JLP target within the policy requires a 50% minimum carbon reduction against a baseline of 2005 levels. We use the BEIS data, which is released annually, albeit it's a year in arrears because of the complexities around gathering all the component data. As a data set, it's slightly restricted. There are some things that are omitted. So it's not a complete picture, but certainly it's the best and most readily available that we've got, and does go all the way down to 2005. Shows strong level of performance for Plymouth and South Hams. Less so for West Devon, albeit it's still well above the trajectory towards meeting that target by 2034. Certainly the figures around South Hams and West Devon reflect that a lot of the biggest challenges are around managing carbon emissions attributable to rural transport, as I'm sure you'd understand and expect. The dispersed nature of the settlement pattern around West Devon, obviously there are longer journeys between settlements and to get to and from the settlements that have got the important services and facilities. So that's partly why the degree of carbon reduction in West Devon lags ever so slightly behind South Hams and Plymouth. There again, the spatial strategy that we're implementing with the joint local plan that seeks to direct new development towards our more sustainable settlements certainly has half an eye on trying to reduce those overall carbon emissions from travel and transport in rural areas. The other challenge around this target is that since the adoption of the joint local plan, and very soon after the adoption of the joint local plan, all three of the councils declared climate emergencies and started working on climate emergency action plans. So the challenge will be aligning how the targets of the local plan accord with the commitments that each of the councils make as part of their the work on the climate emergency declarations. And certainly that's a piece of work that will be progressing year on year, making sure that we understand what those commitments needs to be across all three councils, and making sure as well that obviously, as I say, that we reach that 50% target as a minimum and go as far beyond that as possible. Next slide, please. I-30 is the number of neighbourhood plans that we've got within the joint local plan area. 27 neighbourhood plans areas designated, 12 plans being made, which is the term for being through referendum and adopted. 8 additional plans are ready for referendum, but obviously they have had to wait because there's been the delays in terms of elections and referendums as part of the response to the pandemic. 1 plan is examination, and 6 more plans are sort of coming through in preparation. Certainly those areas that have prepared neighbourhood plans and had them adopted, I'm sure anyone who's been involved with those will advocate the preparation and the use of neighbourhood plans as a really valuable expression of the way that local communities want to see and manage change in their areas. I know Councillor Pearce was very involved in the Thurston Neighbourhood Plan, is a strong advocate for the policies that the plan contains, and the kind of the ethos behind it, and the community-led process that has led to that plan being made and those policies being adopted alongside the joint local plan policies. Certainly in South Hams and West Devon, we've got a dedicated neighbourhood plans officer, and I'm sure he would be only too keen to kind of work with local communities and explain what the benefits are of preparing a neighbourhood plan and how those policies can be developed and will be delivered as part of the decision-making processes. So, Jo, I think it's back to you for the next steps.
Thank you, Phil. I think it's probably worth saying on this as well that the majority of the neighbourhood plans are in South Hams, West Devon, and not in Plymouth, although obviously the Hoe plan is coming forward. And I think there's real challenge to us all to effectively work with our communities and have constructive conversations with them and get them involved in these kind of processes, and understanding that actually the neighbourhood plan process sometimes doesn't offer the most simple and straightforward way to engage with people. So I think that's a challenge for us all going forward in terms of how we can do that effectively, and whether neighbourhood plans in some areas are the right forum, or whether there's different ways of doing it. And certainly Plymouth has done all manner of things in the past in terms of community planning, and we're looking forward to working with members to understand their neighbourhoods and their localities and the issues that they face, and how we can help with that. In terms of next steps, at this stage, obviously we have an adopted plan, which means we need to focus on the delivery of site allocations and getting them built out. So we're going to be focusing, as Phil said, on understanding the up-to-date position on employment and retail, which is obviously really important, particularly due to the COVID implications and the changes introduced by the government. And as part of that, we'll be monitoring the impact of permitted development on the plan strategy. While we're not needing to do the review of the plan until 2024, our team will be working with officers across the authorities to understand how the plan is working and to identify the key issues, challenges and opportunities to be addressed going forward. And a key part of our work is working with yourselves on the joint local plan, and we'll be holding a series of workshops for you to get more involved, and I'll be explaining a little bit more about these later on in the meeting. I hope this gives you a sense of what the plan is doing, and if the Partnership Board members have any questions, obviously we'll be happy to answer those, and thank you very much. Sort of back to you, Judy. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thanks, Phil, too, for such a clear explanation. Now, we have got some member questions that have been submitted in advance. So, Jo, would you like to deal with those first? We've also had a number that have come up in the chat bar, some of which I think are covered by the agenda papers, but if you've got time, you might like to look through those. And I know that the board members have got a couple as well, if there are time for them, but not obligatory. So if you'd like to go through the list you've got, Jo, I think that's probably the best start, isn't it?
Yeah, fine. Okay, so we've had, I'll just share my screen again because that might just help with the questions and responding to that. We've had a number of questions from some of the councillors in advance, which was really helpful and what we encourage. So thank you for those. I'll just bear with me, check that you can start to see this. Okay, can you see that slide which has got question 1 on it? Hopefully you can.
Yep, that's fine. It's
excellent. So there was 2 sort of series of questions, well, 3 series. There was questions around sort of rural businesses and agriculture, and then some questions around Totnes and the air quality. So Phil, do you want to just run through some of these questions and then I'll take the questions as they come through?
Yeah, thank you, Jo. And thank you to Councillors Crozier and Southcott for the first question, which was around whether or not the sustainability criteria within the JLP are stifling rural business. I think the first thing to point out, I guess, is what we've long known the NPPF defining sustainable development as, which is securing economic, environmental and social gains at the same time. And I think there's been a degree of debate and deliberation in South Hams and West Devon around the policy Dev 15, which is the rural economy policy. I would certainly advocate reading the plan as a whole to understand how the plan is proactive and supportive of rural business and under which the circumstances that the joint local plan promotes and directs new development to occur. When I work with DM colleagues in terms of the consideration of planning applications, the process that we use is we start at the top and we work down. The key strategic policies at the top, including SPT1 and SPT2, which kind of explain how we're going to deliver sustainable development, provides a basis for then how we apply the other policies. I think the key elements in policy SPT1 is the commitment around enabling sustainable and low carbon economy across the plan area. And that means the right kind of employment opportunities in the right places. And I think we continue to be proactive in the way that we work with DM colleagues. The settlement hierarchy, as explained in policy TTV1, that provides those key sustainable locations that we're seeking to direct new development towards. And in terms of from a monitoring point of view, the way that we consider the effectiveness of the policies that we've got within the plan are looking at the feedback that we get from appeal decisions that we get from the planning inspectorate. And it's a consistent and ongoing theme that the policies that we've got within the plan are recognised by PINS as not only being in accordance with national policy, but also the way that we're applying them is entirely consistent, and the PINS have upheld the vast majority of the decisions that we've made regarding those key policies with regard to the rural economy. Councillor Pearce has already alluded to future engagement sessions that we're going to be running with members over the next few months. And that's certainly an opportunity there for us to better understand any of the concerns or issues that members might have with our existing policies, and also explain how we apply them at this point in time. It's also an opportunity to consider how these policies might evolve in the near future as well. And certainly if members have got any ideas or opinions about how that might happen, that would certainly be the right forum to explore that and discuss what those issues might be. The next slide, Joe, please. I think it's a question on a similar theme. And this particular question came from Councillor Foss, although I know it's a question and a theme that other members are interested in as well. Does the development in the countryside policy enable appropriate development to support the needs of agriculture? I suppose that the first point to make here is with regard to the use class order and the land use classes that we give planning permission for, it doesn't give us a great deal of flexibility to recognise the specific differences within the agricultural sector. And the overall aim and emphasis of TTV 26, which is the development in the countryside policy, is to protect the countryside from inappropriate development. And I'm sure we can all understand there's a lot of different drivers for change now in the countryside than there were when the planning system was first derived. The countryside was very much the domain of agriculture. And there wasn't the same level of demand in terms of leisure and recreation and people wanting to increasingly move and live within the countryside. Councillor Foss and I have discussed it a few times, but I think we are clear that there, as the adopted development plan, we could perhaps have done with a clearer vision around what we expect the role of the countryside to be, and certainly how we're going to respond to the challenges that the agricultural sector in particular are dealing with. We are working proactively with other local planning authorities, in particular Cornwall Council, who have got a draft policy at the moment as part of their climate emergency DPD that is explicit around a policy around how we deal with planning applications related to agricultural development. And again, the engagement sessions that we've got coming up, that will certainly be an opportunity to explore what we think that policy or that new approach needs to be in the next iteration of the development plan. Next one, Joe, is that still mine?
Yeah, you can take it if you want. Go for it.
Okay, yes, right, thank you. Yeah, these were the questions from Councillor Birch. I think we've got 2 or 3 related questions around air quality and particularly the management around Totnes. I think we've summarised and tried to kind of condense the questions themselves, but you can kind of you can see the broad thrust of the questions there. So the first one is around recent planning decisions in Totnes taking account of the need for an appropriate strategy to mitigate any impact on the AQMA. Policy Dev 2 is applied with full weight when it comes to decision making in terms of new applications within any part of the plan area, but particularly in areas where we've got identified AQMAs. The development management team, there's a requirement for air quality impact assessments as part of any new developments, any new planning applications that come forward that have an impact on an AQMA or a potential AQMA. And they work proactively with the developers to ensure that we've got all of the information required to make an informed and appropriate decision. We are guided by the Institute of Air Quality Guidance, so that kind of prescribes the nature and type of the information that we require of an applicant, and that takes into account cumulative impact of other developments as well. And there are a number of sort of proactive measures that we can take in terms of requiring things like electric vehicle charging points, travel vouchers, green travel plans and packs, and that kind of thing for new residents. Obviously, the identification and collection of money in terms of developer contributions to deal with impacts on the AQMA is only one part of the process. And when we come on to the next question, which is around cumulative impacts and how we kind of understand it and mitigate and manage those, there is an ongoing emphasis on partnership work here. So we work closely with colleagues at Devon County in terms of firstly identifying what the management plan needs to be in terms of the managing and improving the impacts of the AQMA. Also, we work quite closely with other local planning authorities through the Duty to Cooperate process, including Teambridge and Torbay, to understand what any over and additional cumulative impacts might be on the AQMAs in our area, because part of our understanding of the AQMA is modelling and managing the movements through the AQMAs. So obviously we know that Teambridge and Torbay have a particular impact on the A385 AQMA through Totnes. So we have ongoing dialogue with those local planning authorities, and both of those authorities are in a position where they are looking to start to review at least certain parts of their adopted development plans in the next year or two as well. So that's certainly a live topic that we're aware of and that we are engaging with on a regular basis. Anything of any degree of relevance will of course be relayed to members as well, so give you the opportunity to feed into that process and comment on anything once we've got any information from those local planning authorities that you need to be aware of. And the next question, Joe, is around the impacts of the developments. So the air quality management plan, with particular regard to Totnes, is an area that Devon County Council are responsible for in terms of devising and implementing. And we work closely with Devon County to understand the nature of how the developer contributions are being used, what sort of projects and programs they're looking to invest in. For those of you that have been involved, I'm sure you'll know there's a kind of a long and tricky history with regards to the management plans. AQMAs are designated for a very particular reason, and a lot of those are around the specific topographical challenges around the town, the through flows, and a lot of the areas that have got AQMAs struggle with a lack of opportunity to invest significantly in physical improvements, because a lot of them go through already built up areas. So Devon County are responsible for the delivery of the management plan. We have had a few small projects delivered and a number of things achieved, but obviously there are other opportunity areas that would have been identified in the management plan that haven't been implemented yet. And certainly if there's an opportunity to discuss with your county councillors how these can be prioritised through partnership with Devon County, then that's something that should be pursued. Other things that could change the way that we deal with things like managing AQMAs and the management plans are around things like the Environment Bill, for example, which might kind of change the way the roles and responsibilities of public bodies in terms of how we work collectively to ensure that those the projects identified in the management plans are delivered in a timely and effective manner. That, I think, probably summarises the response to those particular questions. I know that Ian Luscombe has provided some more information, Joe, in terms of the detail of Totnes, which I won't go into greater detail on now, given its limited local relevance. But certainly I can make that available to Councillor Birch and Totnes members if they want to take that on further.
Thanks, Phil. Judy, would it be helpful if we start going through some of the questions in the chat?
Yes, I think Councillor Coker had got a question.
Yeah.
That he'd submitted.
I did. Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Chair, I should say. My question, what are the key implications of the government's potential changes to use class orders and the implication of proposed permitted development rights to change classes to residential? Joe, I don't know if you can take that one.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Coker. So, unfortunately, the changes and the flexibility introduced by the government takes control away from planning system and the plan. That's the world in which we're living to. There are significant implications from this change, because what it's done is removes things like shops and offices, so Class A and Class B1 and various other town centre uses, and puts them all together into a new class, which is called Class E, and allows, therefore, those uses to change between themselves without any kind of planning permission. That has huge implications for the towns and city centres, for out-of-town locations. It undermines the policies that identify specific types of uses. It removes the ability to use primary shopping frontages, and specifically raises questions on how we monitor those uses and report against the targets that we've got in the plan. And that's relevant particularly for the sort of retail shops, but also the B1 uses that we do have in there. You're right, Councillor Coker, the government have recently consulted on the potential for Class E, so all those uses that are now wrapped up together, to change to residential through permitted development and a prior approval process. The joint local plan authorities have objected to this proposal and identified significant concerns. There are likely to be significant adverse consequences on the town centres, as well as contradicting the design and building back beautiful agenda that the government have got. There's concerns about reducing the ability to achieve affordable housing and ensuring appropriate living standards, as well as the various unintended consequences of infrastructure from unplanned development in highly unsustainable locations in many instances, and unsuitable places. So, as we've said, we've objected. It's also worth knowing that there's been a lot of opposition to this proposal, including from business groups and the British Property Federation. Going forward, we're going to be monitoring these issues and their impact on the plan and the strategy to understand, where growth is occurring and what effect that will have. And next year's monitoring report will start to show some of those issues, but it's certainly going to be a very big issue for us to deal with going forward. I hope that helps, Councillor Coker.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. Challenging times.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to sort of start to go through the questions, Chair, if that would help.
I think Councillor Moss has got one question. If you could answer that one, and then we'll go down the chat bar, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Councillor Moss.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I did put it in the chat box as well, just in case. So you can feel free to ignore that one as you work your way down through. So it was really to see what sort of impact the COVID has had on development within our area, and are there any key issues from that we need to be aware of going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Really good question, Councillor Mott. So the report that we've presented today obviously monitors indicators to March 2020. So we're working in a slightly odd world that this AMR doesn't reflect the implications of the world we're now living in and the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. And all those will, of course, be reported next year. There is going to be a significant impact, numerous things, and I'll run through some of those. Certainly, there's going to be an impact on housing completions data due to the first lockdown, when we did see a significant reduction in housing starts, and that's in our area, but also nationally. We're therefore expecting a reduced housing figures over the next few years, and that is obviously a national issue. The government were very pragmatic in the housing delivery test last year, and we would hope that that would be the case next year due to the national lockdown in April and May. So, while we're expecting to have a 5-year land supply going forward, I think it will be challenging times, and we'll need to look at that in detail to try and see what the impact will be. There are also considerable other issues raised, because the pandemic has effectively sped up the land use and social changes that were probably already happening. So specifically the way people work, commuting patterns, retail, and the role and function of town centres. We've just talked about that a little bit, which has also been recognised with the whole Class E issue. In addition, there's also been changes to the way we use our local environments, the green spaces and the essential services, and the whole impact on health and well-being. And we'll be really interested to look at that going forward and see what happens. So those are the kinds of key topics that we'll be picking up specifically in obviously the employment and retail surveys work, but also through the work that the placemaking team in South Hams, West Devon will be doing, understanding the settlements and their role and function, as well as the role of the city centre and the Plymouth teams will be working on. And we'll be working with officers and also yourselves, members, across the authorities to understand what those implications are and the key issues. Mindful of the fact that data is always lags behind, so it's probably going to be a couple of years before we really see what the longer term impacts are going to be. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting, and certainly some sort of slightly strange figures in terms of trend lines next year, but will be very important to see what that actually means for the plan. I hope that answers your question, Councillor Martin.
It does. Thank you very much, Jo.
No problem.
Yes, thank you, Jo. Would you like to start going down the chat bar now and pick up some of those questions? Thank you.
Absolutely. So the first question, I hope I've got that right, is from Councillor Hopwood about the percentages and figures. Where do the Plymouth urban fringe figures go, in Plymouth or the South Hams? So things that are developed in South Hams but are in the fringe go into the Plymouth policy area. So the Plymouth policy area covers part of Plymouth City Council and part of South Hams, and so they are, where they're in the urban fringe, they are in the Plymouth policy area, but where we report them for the local authority, they would go into the relevant authority. So in some instances that would also be in the Plymouth policy area, but also in South Hams. I hope that helps with that question. In terms of the next question, Councillor Nicholson, I think that's a really good idea. I think we should probably look at what are the developments coming through from permitted development and report it separately. I don't think I'd want to remove it. I think we just need to report the number separately. But I think that will be really important going forward. So a good suggestion. We'll certainly take you up on that, and thank you for that suggestion. Councillor Cheadle, West Devon, not consistent.
I can take this one, Jo. It's I suppose this is what happens when you use and look at statistics. Obviously, the figure that Councillor Cheadle has offered there does point to West Devon being quite a long way down the National League table, as it were. I suppose that the figure that I was referring to is the percentage of premises unable to achieve 30 megabits per second. The national average for rural areas is 20%, and West Devon has 22.5%. So the 22.5%, the 20% don't sound very different, but clearly when you put that against a figure of 500 in a league table of 560, obviously West Devon, there's quite a degree of progress that they need to do there to get back up to that a national average for the rural areas. So yeah, kind of accept the point that you're making there, Councillor Cheadle. It's just, I suppose, a linguistic difference in terms of how you interpret the figures in front of us.
And I think we would certainly accept, that we need to do more if we can and where we can to improve that broadband connectivity. That's
why Southampton and West Devon are advertising for, I think it's a digital connectivity communication specialist or something around that, that seeks to kind of accelerate the progress in terms of broadband rollout to get West Devon up that league table and obviously within South Hams as well, to try and ensure that we're at the forefront of broadband rollout in rural areas.
Thanks, Phil. Councillor Kelly, Mutley, we've dealt with that, hopefully, and obviously any more detail could go back to Phil and we can provide you with that. Councillor Hodgson, wildlife and biodiversity monitored. So this is an interesting point. The monitoring in the authority's monitoring report relates to specific indicators in the joint local plan, and it's not exhaustive. So wildlife and biodiversity aren't a specific monitoring indicator through the plan, but that doesn't mean to say we wouldn't want to. It's just perhaps that the joint local plan isn't the best mechanism to do that. It might be, I would suggest that perhaps the climate emergency and biodiversity emergency action plans might be a better mechanism to secure the sort of consistent monitoring through that process, although happy to, if anyone wants to say that the joint local plan is the way forward with that. But I think the joint local plan isn't everything to all people, and there's certainly recognised there are some gaps. I don't know whether, Phil, you've got any more thoughts on any of that?
No, only in as much, I think next time round, when it comes to understanding what the nature of the indicators are and how they relate to the policies, having those early engagement sessions with members is going to be really important to understand where their aims and aspirations are for future policy development. And when we do that, doing so in such a way that we understand how we are going to measure those policies and the impact of those policies and effectiveness is an important part of that consideration as well. So that's certainly something that we would factor into those engagement sessions and making sure we get that right next time around to be fully comprehensive.
I think Councillor Hodgson wants to come back, but please don't take up too much time, Councillor Hodgson, because there are lots of other questions.
I just think this is a really, really important part of the monitoring that should be taking place. I mean, I don't know about the other two councils. I know they've declared climate emergencies, but we've also declared a biodiversity emergency. And if we don't look at it across the area, I mean, biodiversity doesn't just happen with a couple of hedgehogs underneath a bush, by an application site. It's the overall picture that is crashing, as we know. Wildlife is crashing. So surely this is a really important monitoring. To be fair, probably more important than broadband. So I just think it's a really important assessment that we should be carrying out, and I would really like to see it taken, that seriously, that we do actually look at it at this level.
Okay, thank you. Joe, do you want to carry on, or do you want to reply to that? Or
yeah, no, I'll carry on. That's fine. Councillor Cheadle, study on improving the A386. And I think there's another question about that, the Woolwell to the George below from Councillor Hopwood, in terms of an update on that. Who's the best place to provide any kind of update?
Chair, would you like me to come in on an update on that?
I was going to volunteer you there, Chris, so I'm quite glad
yeah,
you
thank
jumped
you, Chris.
Yeah, well, afternoon, everybody. So there's two parts to this. I think there's the Woolwell to the George main piece of infrastructure, which is so crucial to unlocking the Woolwell development, and clearly that's a long-term game involving Plymouth are here and represented, and they may want to speak for themselves, but I know they have already committed significant amounts of money towards that scheme in terms of the design and land assembly, and it's in their capital programme, so it's committed and it's working forward. There is a conversation ongoing with Devon County Council, because although it's in the Plymouth boundary, the houses it serves are within the Devon area. So there is the need for a greater join up, and there's some lobbying that we're doing with Devon County Council to get them to hopefully align better to our strategic ambitions. And then if cycling was part of that conversation, and forgive me, I haven't actually seen the question, there's some very positive work going on between Dartmoor National Park, Devon County Council, Plymouth, South Hams and West Devon and Sustrans to bring forward something there that can deliver a really cohesive cycle experience from Plymouth all the way through to Tavistock, which would take in Woolwell to the George and then go on across Roebury Down. So there is already a lot of work done for the highway infrastructure, but we need to work harder to get Devon County Council on board. And then the cycling stuff is newer and a bit more at the feasibility level, but is also very positive. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Chris. That's helpful. Councillor Crozier is asking about neighbourhood plans and the consultation processes, I think, with that one. Phil, are you
yeah,
familiar
certainly
with that?
When a parish is looking to adopt a neighbourhood plan, and certainly where there is a proposal to allocate sites for certain uses, highways will be involved in the understanding of what the potential impacts of those allocations will be. So when it comes to a planning application on an allocated site within a neighboured plan, highways should already have had some involvement in understanding and accepting the principle of that land use in that location. So yes, I suppose is the answer to the question.
Thank you.
Can I come back on that?
Briefly, please. Yes.
Yeah, very briefly. We have a problem with the current planning decision at the moment, and highways just walk out the door and say it's not necessary, forgetting what the result, the cumulative result of development over years has caused. Their algorithms and metrics, because there's no reported accidents or injuries, means no action, and that is not an answer to narrow roads and communications. The village in question, Beer Alston, has had over 700 houses already developed in the last 50, 60 years. And we're still on the same road network as I said, 1856 to the planning committee, but somebody reminded me there's a map in our parish offices that goes back to early 1700s, and the road network is the same. And we had the motor car for the last 60 years.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Chris. Right, could we perhaps move on to the next question, which I think is Councillor Hipps's, Jo?
Yes, absolutely. So the employment land targets in the joint local plan are targets and aspirations. They are land that is allocated to provide the opportunity for development. A plan doesn't develop. A plan provides developers with the opportunity and flexibility to develop land in conjunction with the market. We have over allocated the number of amount of land and to meet the strict needs that was identified through the employment needs survey. But that's really important to do that because it gives flexibility and it allows choice in the market. So while we are very keen to get employment land developed on the allocations that we have identified, certainly it is not, it's an aspiration, and we would need to look more closely now at what the implications are of the sort of the whole plan policies which have the B1 targets in, given that the class B1 no longer exists. So it's certainly an issue that we're going to be looking at, employment need and employment land, as we move forward to the sort of the next local plan, to really understand what that might mean for different places and how we can address that. I hope that helps with that one. Social housing is the next question. Social housing is part of affordable housing, so we haven't split that out separately. I don't know whether we could, if we, in terms of the monitoring, it's certainly something I can ask our monitoring team, and we can find out for you whether that would be possible, perhaps to monitor or report separately next time round. So thank you for that. We'll take that away and see if we can do that. I think the cycle path has been answered as part of Chris's answer earlier. Green space and whether this can be protected under this plan. So this plan, we aren't allocating green space. We did try it as part of the process. Phil, you might be better at this because I'm more new to the process. If you can recall the depths of your mind for green space allocations.
Partly depends where the green space is. And I suppose to answer the question, this plan can't retrospectively allocate historic green space. However, a neighboured plan can identify a local green space and apply local green space designation in accordance with the MPPF requirements. So I don't know if there's a neighbour plan in place or in preparation, but that's certainly a vehicle you could use to do that.
We were also going to do a local green space DPD. However, that's been paused due to the COVID issues. And I think whether we restart that or we wrap it up into the next local plan process, I think is still a question that we have. So yeah, we can't do it retrospectively, but certainly it can be looked at next time, and we'll take that away for you. The next question, plans to get dedicated safe. Oh, just bear with me. Cycleways across West Devon to join towns and villages. The local plan has numerous objectives in terms of connectivity and safe cycling routes and transport routes as part of it. It's almost the same question in terms of we can't retrospectively identify these, but they're certainly supported as part of our policies that already exist, and I think we have quite strong policies on that. Phil, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think there's a really strong policy framework in terms of encouraging active and sustainable travel. If there are local infrastructure gaps that communities would like to see come forward, and again, the neighbourhood plan is probably the most appropriate vehicle in terms of identifying what they are. Obviously, the real challenges are around land ownership, availability, and who's going to pay for the infrastructure themselves. Yeah, a few different hurdles there, but certainly in terms of the overarching strategic support, the JLP provides that. But when it comes to local delivery, I think neighbourhood plans are the ones that are in the best position to identify specific local infrastructure that might be required.
Thanks, Phil. So there's another question here about cumulative impacts of biodiversity on development sites. I mean, there's certainly something that development management would be looking at in terms of their understanding of the process. Bear with me, I can't see what that says. In terms of what we might be looking at in the future in terms of future allocations, that could be something that we would be starting to look at in terms of the biodiversity implications. And as Phil said earlier, in answer to the previous question, we want to work with you early to see what are the priorities and to work up a more appropriate monitoring strategy next time round. So that's something we can take away. Councillor Birch, yes, we'll put the slides onto the website with the authority monitoring report when it goes up next week. Anything else? The white paper. The white paper has got numerous proposals in it. However, although I don't think it entirely removes site allocations. I think it sort of but it does change potentially how they're used. I thought the actual white paper was still very supportive of neighbourhood planning and further engagement. And I think what neighbourhood plans can be used in very different ways. They don't have to be just about site allocations. They can be positively encouraging all sorts of different things if you've got a particular issue in your area. I think it remains to be seen exactly how the white paper is going to take forward all their numerous proposals, but I would expect neighbourhood planning in some description to be kept. We'll have to slightly see what happens in terms of what it really means in terms of allocations. So I hope that helps. Thank you for that comment about the cycleway. So there's a council from Councillor Hayworth on Moorhampstead to Oakhampton multi-use trail. Yeah, I mean, there's what I suppose working towards the next local plan. These are exactly the issues and the types of infrastructure and the types of proposals that we'll be collecting up from you all, and want to understand what the needs are in your local areas. so that we can then start to factor them into the infrastructure needs assessment and the types of proposals that might need to be worked up and how they could be paid for and what the sort of funding gaps are and how that sort of contribution could be made and how we can secure the land or all the different types of infrastructure provision that's required. So yes, make sure please do send us these kind of things
An
as we
important
go
consideration
forward.
there, Joe, is obviously Moreton Hampstead's in the national park. And obviously as the national park are about to go to examination for their draft local plan, there needs to be some degree of kind of coherence between our plan and the local plan for the national park to ensure that we're sufficiently joined up in the delivery of infrastructure that crosses the boundaries.
Thank you. Phil, do you want to take Councillor Brazil's question?
Yes, and so the specific, without going into too much detail, the specific site in question was also in the undeveloped coast policy area. So it's not a general rule around how we deal with exception sites and their inclusion within a neighbourhood plan. The specific policy requirements within the undeveloped coast mean it's very difficult for a site to be accepted against the provisions of that policy unless we know that whether or not there's a likelihood that that development could be delivered outside the undeveloped coast. So it's a very locally specific issue in relation to how that policy layer relates to the built form of East Prawle. So I think this is probably a question that's probably best considered and debated outside this meeting.
Thank you, Phil. We've got another one from Councillor Hodgson, and then two more after that, and then I think we'll draw a line under this and move on to the next agenda item, if that's all right with you, Jo.
Yeah, that's fine, thank you. This is an interesting question, Councillor Hodgson, about sort of allocating sites and when they come forward. The joint local plan obviously doesn't set trigger points or stop sites coming forward. It identifies them for the life of the plan. And so we don't really have much control in terms of exactly when they come forward. I don't know. Some authorities have tried to do that and link sites coming forward with a certain number of jobs and other things, and with varying success. I know North Somerset got themselves into a bit of trouble with that in terms of those linkages, and the inspector agreed that it wasn't the role of the plan to actually stop development coming forward once you've identified it. And I'm not sure there's anything much we could do about that in terms of trigger mechanisms, although often we do link it with infrastructure provision and, a certain number of homes being built until you need to provide a new transport route or a new school or whatever that might be.
I think the other thing here, Joe, is it's quite a risky game to try and hover just above the 5-year housing supply position. And obviously, recent circumstances could potentially dictate an increase in our lapse rate in terms of the delivery of permissions that we know we've already got in the system. So I think it would be quite a difficult and dangerous game to try and play to kind of manipulate things to that degree of detail.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. We wouldn't want to be doing that. We need a good supply because we don't know quite what's going to happen. And I think the pandemic will show us that next year. The fact that we have actually got a good supply going into the pandemic is going to really help us. If we were so close to the edge, we would be in a very difficult position next year in terms of that, and then we'd have really no control over the types of sites. So I think we need to have as much flexibility in the system as we can. So as Phil says, that we're not hovering just above and giving ourselves a problem later on down the line. Another question here from Councillor Nicholson. Is there any monitoring of spending? Yes, thank you for that question. There's the infrastructure funding schedule. What's it called? IFS, isn't it? I think.
Infrastructure funding statement.
Statement, IFS. Yes, that is produced. They are produced separately because that's now a statutory requirement. So Plymouth has got one, South Hams and West Devon has got another one, and they are actually referred to in the AMR. Phil, do you know which
61,
page?
Yes. Yeah, there are links in the document to take you to the relevant pages for each authority.
Page 61 there, thank you. Question about sheltered, assisted, supported living accommodation considered employment land. No, that would be considered as part of our housing land and housing supply. Fully support the comments of active travel.
Sorry, Joe, just quickly to go back to that previous question.
Yes.
I think that's a specific reference to Plymouth Road, and so I think there's a wider discussion to be had around job creation, and in terms from a monitoring point of view, obviously we can count it against accommodation, but different set of considerations against different policy requirements in terms of what they contribute to that site.
Oh yes. Okay. Thank you, Phil.
Right.
So yeah, is there any other questions I've missed here?
No, I think we've got to the end of the list of questions now. Thank you very much, both of you, for answering those very much on the hoof, but very well. Thank you. That was great. The next thing is the member engagement workshop. So, Joe, are you going to go through these with members just to do a bit of advertising for them?
I am, yes, please. Let me just share my screen with you again. So I just want to talk through what we're going to do. Oh, I can't seem to find it now. Don't know what's going on. Wait, bear with me. Okay, let's start again. So the idea is that we'd like to invite you all to the member workshops that we'll be holding. There's a series of sessions that we would like to have, and we'd like to invite all members from all three authorities, and they'll be running effectively March, April, May for the South Hams, West Devon members, and then for Plymouth, it would be after the elections in May, June, July. And what we'd like to really do is ask yourselves and all your colleagues to come along and discuss with us what the plan is and how it's working. We can give you more information about the topics and the challenges, and really find out what are your areas of concern, what do you like about it. And we'll be setting you some questionnaires and some tasks, and really a forum for debate, so that you can understand what the plan is trying to do, what it can't do, importantly, and how it works, and how you read it as a whole, and all those kind of things, and find out what your areas of concern are going forward. So we'll be sending out invitations next week to the 30th of March session, which will be about setting the scene and starting that dialogue, and depending how many people come, we'll go out into breakout rooms with members of our team, so that we can have these kind of discussions about the different topics. Then we'll be sending out an online survey and questionnaire about the plan and what your concerns are. So that'll be a mixture of questions, short and sharp, should only take you sort of 10-15 minutes to answer that, so that we can really get a good understanding of what the areas you're going to be interested in, what the concerns are for your local area, but also how the plan works, and what you might want to see going forward due to COVID, perhaps the changes in your area, and the key issues. So, wildlife and biodiversity, climate change, all some of the infrastructure issues that have come out today, but there'll also be lots more. So that will be happening in April. And then following the questionnaire, we'd then have another workshop which would give a bit of a feedback and sort of start to summarise those key issues and think about the future and whether the priorities have changed and what we should be thinking about, and to focus on then some topic-based workshops, which we would like to run collectively across all three authorities. So that would mean Plymouth members coming into the workshops with South Hams and West Devon, and that will be held collectively in autumn, winter this year. So a sort of series of events which you can get involved in, and we really like you and to encourage you to start working with us, so that we can progress progress well through the sort of stage we're at now, and then the reviewing of those issues and understanding what they are and setting up the objectives for the sustainability appraisal, feeding in all the kinds of issues that we might have to deal with in terms of the COVID and the pandemic, but also the white paper changes, so that we're in a few years' time really ready to go with the new plan and preparing for that, so that when it comes to the 2024 date, we can then be in a really solid foundation. It might be useful just to sort of end by saying that obviously, we recognise this session hasn't enabled everyone to ask all their questions. So please do bring them to the next sessions. We really encourage that and want to work with you to discuss them and have that interactive discussion. So it's really, a bit of a pitch to please look out for the invitations and get really involved with us over the next 6 to 9 months and beyond, as we start to understand what the plan can do and how it can be made better in due course. That's all I needed to say, really, Judy.
Thank you very much. And before we finish, I don't think we've got any other business, but if we have, please let me know now. I just need to say a word to members of the public who've been listening on YouTube or Facebook Live, because it was my fault we started the meeting early, but I'd only got the time on one piece of paper, which I wasn't actually looking at the time. And so we started at 2 o'clock, not 2:15. But the whole of the proceedings will still be available on Facebook and YouTube. So if you missed the first 10 minutes or so, you can easily catch up, but it was mostly me spouting about the introduction, so you may not want to. But I'd like to thank everybody very much for attending. If there is anything that you want to raise now before we actually switch off, please let me know in the box, but I can't see anything that's come up in the last minute or so. And it's great to have had so many members online, so many members of the public online as well, or watching us through Facebook and YouTube. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at the workshops and at the next annual monitoring review, which we will again hold an AGM in public. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you very much. And thank you especially to officers for all the work you do and for organising the